In a world where power, politics, and prejudice collide, President Jonathan Carter is thrust into the fight of his life, not against enemies of the state, but against the very love he thought was unshakable. His marriage to Alia, a brilliant and beautiful brown woman of Indian descent, has always been a symbol of progress. But when rumors start to swirl, fueled by lies and deceit, their love is put to the ultimate test. A paternity scandal, a shattered trust, and a battle against the forces of racism threaten to destroy everything they've built. Will Jonathan stand by Alia, or will he let the world's hate tear them apart? What if the truth isn't what it seems, and their greatest challenge has yet to unfold? Welcome, dear friends, to this journey of love, resilience, and hope. Whether you're joining us for the first time or you're a cherished member of our family, we are so grateful to have you here. Today, we embark on a story that will touch your heart, stir your emotions, and remind us all of the power of love in its purest form. In a world that often seems divided, this tale offers a beacon of light, showing us that trust, respect, and courage can overcome even the darkest of times. As we dive into this beautiful journey together, I want to take a moment to send you my warmest prayers and deepest love. May this story bring you comfort, joy, and inspiration, reminding you that no matter the challenges, love will always find a way. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. We're so excited to have you with us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay connected with us as we continue to share stories that uplift and inspire. Let's make this journey together, one filled with love, hope, and endless possibilities. Join the conversation, share your thoughts, and be part of a community that believes in the power of love to change the world. Stay tuned for more, and let the story unfold. Jonathan Carter was a man born for the spotlight. At just 38 years old, he had climbed to the pinnacle of political power, becoming the youngest president in his nation's history. He was celebrated as a visionary leader, someone who spoke not only with eloquence, but also with heart. His progressive policies were a beacon of hope in a world fractured by division. Yet, for all his achievements and accolades, the one part of his life that drew the most attention and the sharpest criticism was not his presidency, but his marriage. Alia Mera Carter was unlike any first lady the country had ever seen. Born in Mumbai, India, she moved to the United States as a child and grew up balancing two worlds: her vibrant Indian heritage and the often unforgiving culture of assimilation. Her beauty was undeniable, with her glowing brown skin, dark, expressive eyes, and a radiant smile that seemed to light up any room she entered. But it wasn't just her looks that captivated Jonathan when he first met her. It was her mind. Alia was brilliant, a Harvard-educated lawyer who had devoted her career to fighting for racial equality and immigrant rights. She was his equal in every way, challenging his ideas and pushing him to see perspectives beyond his own. Their love story was nothing short of a fairy tale. They met at a university event years before Jonathan's political career began. He was instantly smitten by her confidence as she passionately debated issues of global justice. When he asked her out for coffee afterward, she hesitated. "Your trouble," she had said with a teasing smile, her voice laced with skepticism. "And you're the most fascinating person I've ever met," he replied, refusing to take no for an answer. What followed was a whirlwind romance that broke boundaries and defied expectations. Despite coming from different worlds, their connection was undeniable. Alia, with her deep empathy and sharp intellect, balanced Jonathan's ambitious drive and idealism. Together, they dreamed of creating a life where love triumphed over prejudice, where their union would symbolize a bridge between cultures. When Jonathan proposed, kneeling before her on the steps of her family's home in Mumbai, Alia knew what she was signing up for. She wasn't naive. Marrying a man destined for the political stage meant living under constant scrutiny. But she loved him, deeply, fiercely, and with a conviction that was unshakable. "Yes," she had whispered, tears streaming down her face as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Their wedding was a celebration of unity, blending traditions from both their cultures. Jonathan wore a crisp black tuxedo, while Alia stunned in a crimson sari adorned with intricate gold embroidery. Guests danced to a mix of Bollywood hits and Western classics, symbolizing the fusion of their worlds. For a brief moment, it seemed like their love was enough to silence the critics. But the honeymoon phase didn't last long. From the moment Jonathan announced his candidacy for president, the whispers began. Some questioned Alia's place by his side, unable to reconcile the image of a brown woman as the First Lady. Others hinted that her exotic beauty was a political ploy, a way for Jonathan to appear progressive. The tabloids were relentless, digging into her past, publishing pictures of her in college with male friends, and spinning baseless narratives. Things worsened after their son Zayn was born. Zayn was a vibrant, curious child with Jonathan's piercing blue eyes and Alia's warm complexion. To his parents, he was perfect. To the world, he was a target. Commentators began speculating about his parentage, with one notorious tabloid running a headline that read, "First Lady's Secret Scandal. Is Zayn really his?" Jonathan tried to shield Alia from the noise, but the attacks were relentless. Rival politicians seized the opportunity to question his judgment, claiming that his marriage was a distraction from his duties. Some even went so far as to suggest that Alia's background made her unfit to represent the nation. "She's not one of us," they whispered. For Alia, the scrutiny was exhausting but not surprising. She had faced prejudice her entire life, from classmates who mocked her accent as a child to colleagues who underestimated her abilities as an adult. But this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about her marriage, her family, her very identity. One night, as they sat together in the presidential residence, Alia turned to Jonathan, her voice steady despite the tears brimming in her eyes. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "Regret what?" Jonathan replied, startled. "Choosing me. Us." Jonathan's heart broke at the question. He reached for her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. "Alia," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are my choice. Every single day you are my choice. The world doesn't get to decide our story. We do." Despite his reassurances, the pressure mounted. The constant barrage of rumors and the relentless questioning of their love began to chip away at the foundation they had worked so hard to build. Jonathan, torn between his responsibilities as president and his role as a husband, found himself doubting his ability to protect Alia and Zayn from the storm. And so the seeds of mistrust were planted, not in their love, but in their ability to withstand the forces conspiring against them. Alia remained poised in public, her head held high as she continued her work as First Lady. But behind closed doors, she wondered how long their love could survive in a world determined to tear them apart. For Jonathan, the challenge was clear. He had to prove, not just to the world, but to Alia, that their bond was unbreakable. Little did he know that the journey ahead would test their love in ways they never could have imagined. Jonathan Carter had always known the cost of power. As president, every decision he made, every word he spoke, and every action he took was scrutinized under a microscope. But what he hadn't anticipated was that the sharpest attacks wouldn't come against his policies or his leadership. They would strike at the heart of his family. As his approval rating soared and his progressive agenda began reshaping the country, Jonathan's political rivals grew desperate. They knew they couldn't beat him on his vision for the nation, so they took aim at something far more personal: his marriage. It began subtly: anonymous comments on social media, vague insinuations in political blogs. Alia, they whispered, was too perfect, too composed, too flawless to be real. Soon the whispers turned into a coordinated attack. The story broke one evening on a notorious tabloid site: First Lady's secret affair exposed. The article claimed that Alia had been romantically involved with Daniel Hayes, a former aide in Jonathan's campaign team. Jonathan was in a late-night meeting when his chief of staff burst into the room, clutching a tablet. "Mr. President, we have a problem," she said, her voice grave. The article was accompanied by a series of blurry photographs: Alia and Daniel laughing at a campaign event, a casual hug shared in a crowded room. To the untrained eye, they looked innocent, but the article's narrative twisted them into something salacious. "This is absurd," Jonathan said, his brow furrowing. "We know it's not true," his chief of staff replied. "But the public might not. The opposition is running with it. They're framing this as a betrayal, questioning Zayn's paternity." Jonathan's stomach sank. He had expected political mudslinging, but this was an attack on his wife, the mother of his child. And worse, it struck at the insecurity society had never let them escape: Alia's ethnicity, their intercultural marriage, and the perception that she didn't belong. By morning, the story had exploded. Every major news network covered it, some condemning the baseless accusations, others giving airtime to the speculation. Social media was a battlefield, with hashtags like #1 First Lady Scandal trending. For every post defending Alia, there were dozens more casting doubt on her character. At the presidential residence, Alia sat in the sunlit living room, her phone buzzing incessantly with messages from friends and colleagues. She had seen the article, she had read the comments, yet she sat with her shoulders straight, her expression calm. Only her hands, clenched tightly in her lap, betrayed her inner turmoil. When Jonathan entered the room, she looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. There was no anger in her gaze, only hurt. "So," she said quietly, "they've decided to tear us apart." Jonathan sat beside her, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. "Alia, you know this isn't true," he said. "Of course, I know it's not true," she replied, her voice steady but edged with pain. "The question is, do you?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Jonathan opened his mouth to reply, but hesitated. He wasn't doubting her. He was doubting everything else: the media, the public, the relentless pressure of their lives. But his silence spoke louder than any accusation. Alia stood, her movements graceful but firm. "I've spent my entire life proving myself," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "proving that I belong in this country, that I'm more than the color of my skin, that I'm not a stereotype. And now I have to prove myself to you." Jonathan rose to follow her, guilt tightening his chest. "Alia, it's not that I don't trust you. It's the situation. It's the optics. They're questioning Zayn, our family, everything we've built. He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence without making it worse. Alia turned to face him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Jonathan, I stood by you when the world said we wouldn't last. I defended us when they said our love was a political move. I have given everything to this life we've built together. If you can't look me in the eye right now and tell me that you trust me, then what do we even have?" Her words were a knife to his heart. Jonathan reached for her again, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "I need some time," she said softly before walking out of the room. For the first time in their marriage, Jonathan felt powerless. He had faced hostile congressmen, global crises, and political scandals, but nothing had ever left him as shaken as the sight of Aaliyah walking away from him. The hours that followed were some of the longest of Jonathan's life. The president's office was flooded with questions from reporters demanding a statement. Political advisors urged him to issue a denial and distance himself from the rumors. Some even suggested that Aaliyah step out of the spotlight for a while. "She's a liability right now," one advisor said bluntly. "We can't afford this distraction." Jonathan slammed his fist on the table, startling everyone in the room. "She's my wife," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "And she's not going anywhere." But even as he defended her publicly, the seed of doubt lingered in his mind. Not about her loyalty, but about whether he had done enough to protect her. For the first time, he wondered if his love for Aaliyah had exposed her to a world of cruelty she didn't deserve. That evening, he found her in their bedroom, sitting by the window with a book in her lap. She wasn't reading it. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, lost in thought. "Aaliyah," he said gently, breaking the silence. She didn't turn. "Do you trust me?" she asked, echoing her earlier question. Jonathan knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "With my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner. I'm sorry for making you feel like you ever had to prove yourself to me. You are my heart, Aaliyah. You always have been." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face for the truth. Slowly, she nodded, but the pain lingered. "This isn't just about us, Jonathan," she said softly. "It's about what we represent. If we let them tear us apart, we're telling the world that love like ours can't survive, and I can't let them win." Jonathan nodded, his resolve hardening. He vowed in that moment to fight not just for their marriage, but for the values they had built their lives on. Together they would weather the storm, no matter how fierce it became. The days that followed the explosive rumors were a blur for Jonathan Carter. His once orderly life, governed by schedules and strategy, had become an emotional battlefield. He spent his mornings in the Oval Office, making decisions that would shape the nation, but his nights were filled with sleeplessness and a growing sense of unease. The rumors refused to die down. Despite their denials, whispers persisted on social media, in the press, and even within his inner circle. Jonathan's trusted advisors tiptoed around the subject, careful not to overstep, but subtly suggesting damage control. Every time he heard the words optics or reputation, a knot tightened in his stomach. At home, the tension was palpable. Aaliyah maintained her grace, moving through their home with her usual elegance. She attended to Zayn, worked on her advocacy projects, and even managed a faint smile when reporters snapped pictures of her at public events. But Jonathan knew her too well to be fooled. Behind her calm facade, she was hurting. One evening, Jonathan found himself in their library, staring at the photographs lining the shelves. There were pictures from their wedding, their first campaign together, and candid shots of Aaliyah laughing with Zayn in the garden. Each image told a story of love, partnership, and hope. Yet now those memories felt tainted by the doubts gnawing at his mind. He didn't want to doubt her. He didn't want to believe that the woman who had stood by him through every challenge could betray him. But the pressure was suffocating. Everywhere he turned, someone was questioning their marriage. His political opponents were relentless, framing the rumors as a reflection of his judgment. Even his supporters, the people who had once cheered for their love story, seemed to waver. "Mr. President," one advisor had said earlier that day, "perception is everything. You can't ignore this." "And what would you have me do?" Jonathan had snapped. Publicly accuse my wife of something I know she didn't do? But even as he defended Aaliyah, the doubt lingered, insidious and unwelcome. That night he sat at the edge of their bed, watching Aaliyah brush her hair by the vanity. She looked ethereal in the soft glow of the lamp, her brown skin radiant, her movements deliberate. Jonathan felt a pang of guilt. How could he let himself question her? "Aaliyah," he said softly, breaking the silence. She paused, meeting his gaze in the mirror. "Yes?" He hesitated, unsure how to voice the storm inside him without causing more harm. Do you think this is too much for us?" Her brow furrowed and she turned to face him. "What do you mean?" "This," he said, gesturing vaguely. "The presidency, the scrutiny, the constant attacks. I never wanted you to carry this weight." Aaliyah stood and walked over to him, her expression unreadable. "Jonathan, I knew what I was signing up for when I married you. We talked about this. How our love would be questioned, how our family would be judged. None of this is new. But it's different now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're attacking you. They're attacking Zane. And I—" He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "I feel like I'm failing you." Aaliyah knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. Her touch was warm, grounding him in the chaos. "Jonathan," she said gently, "you are not failing me. This isn't about you or me. It's about a world that still struggles to accept what we represent. And yes, it hurts. But we can't let their hate define us." Her words should have comforted him, but instead they amplified the conflict within him. How could she remain so composed when his own resolve was crumbling? "Aaliyah, I want to believe that love is enough," he said, his voice cracking, "but I see the way people look at us. I hear the things they say. Sometimes I feel like we're fighting a battle we can't win." Aaliyah's eyes filled with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. "Do you remember the night we talked about this? Before we got married?" Jonathan nodded. How could he forget? They had stayed up until dawn, sitting on the floor of her tiny apartment talking about the future. She had warned him then about the challenges they would face. "People will try to tear us down," she had said. "They'll call me names. They'll question our love, but if we stay strong, if we hold on to each other, we can get through anything." "You believed in us so much," he murmured, "and I don't know if I'm strong enough to live up to that." Aaliyah cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Jonathan Carter, you are the strongest man I know, but even strong men have moments of doubt. What matters is what you choose to do next." Her words were a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge. Yet the doubt still lingered, a shadow that refused to disappear. Jonathan wanted to fight for their love, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the world was conspiring to tear them apart. As the days passed, the distance between them grew. Jonathan threw himself into his work, attending meetings and giving speeches with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Aaliyah, meanwhile, focused on Zane and her advocacy work, spending hours in her office or attending events. They spoke less, their conversations reduced to polite exchanges. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Aaliyah broke the silence. "Jonathan," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I need you to trust me, completely, without hesitation." He looked up, startled by the intensity in her gaze. "I do trust you," he said automatically. "Do you?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "Because it doesn't feel like it. And if you can't trust me, if you can't believe in what we've built, then everything we've worked for means nothing." Her words struck a chord deep within him. Jonathan realized then that his doubts weren't just hurting their marriage, they were undermining the very foundation of their love. He had let the pressure of his role cloud his judgment, and in doing so, he had let Aaliyah down. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I've been so consumed by everything happening around us that I lost sight of what matters most. You, Zayn, United States. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Aaliyah's expression softened, and she reached for his hand. "Then start by remembering why we fell in love. Remember the promises we made to each other, because no rumor, no lie can destroy what we have, unless we let it." Jonathan nodded, a sense of clarity washing over him. He realized then that the fight wasn't just against his political rivals or the media. It was against the fear and doubt that had crept into his heart. And for Aaliyah, for their family, he was ready to fight with everything he had. The morning Jonathan's advisors brought up the paternity test, the air in the Oval Office was heavy with tension. They sat around the polished mahogany table, their faces grim. Jonathan could feel the weight of their stares as one of his senior aides leaned forward, her voice carefully measured. "Mr. President, the rumors aren't going away. In fact, they're escalating. Public confidence in your leadership is being undermined." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "And what exactly are you suggesting I do about it?" he asked coldly, though deep down he already knew. The aide hesitated for a moment, then pressed on. "The simplest way to end this is to address the rumors head-on. A paternity test would put everything to rest." The room fell silent, the suggestion hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Jonathan's eyes darted to his chief of staff, who nodded reluctantly. "It's not ideal," she admitted, "but the opposition has weaponized this. They're sowing seeds of doubt, not just about your family, but about your integrity as a leader." Jonathan's hands clenched into fists on the table. The very idea of questioning Zayn's parentage felt like a betrayal, not just to Aaliyah, but to their love, their family, and everything they stood for. "I won't insult my wife like that," he said firmly. "This is absurd." "Mr. President," another advisor chimed in, "I understand how you feel, but this isn't about your feelings. It's about protecting your presidency. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made." Jonathan's temper flared. "Sacrifices? You're asking me to sacrifice my wife's dignity and my son's identity for the sake of optics?" The room fell silent again, the tension palpable. Later that evening, Jonathan returned to the residence, his mind racing. He found Aaliyah in the garden, sitting on a bench with Zayn nestled beside her, his curly hair catching the golden light of the setting sun. The sight should have brought him peace, but instead, it only deepened his turmoil. When Zayn ran off to play with his toys, Jonathan sat beside Aaliyah. She sensed his tension immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice calm but concerned. He hesitated, unsure how to broach the subject. Finally, he said, "The team thinks we should consider a paternity test." Aaliyah froze, her hand tightening around the book she'd been holding. She turned to him slowly, her eyes wide with disbelief. "A paternity test," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan nodded, guilt washing over him. "They think it's the only way to silence the rumors and protect my image." Aaliyah stood abruptly, taking a few steps away from him. Her shoulders were rigid, her back turned. When she finally spoke, her voice was laced with a quiet fury that cut deeper than any shout ever could. "So this is what it's come to," she said, her words measured. "You, of all people, doubting me, doubting us." "I don't doubt you," Jonathan said quickly, rising to his feet. "I know the truth, Aaliyah. I know Zayn is my son. But this isn't just about us anymore. It's about the presidency, the public." She spun around to face him, her eyes flashing. The public? The presidency? Is that what matters most to you now? More than your family? Her voice cracked on the last word, and Jonathan felt a stab of pain in his chest. "Alia, please," he said, stepping toward her. "You know this isn't what I want. But the pressure is mounting, and I don't know how else to protect us." Alia let out a bitter laugh, tears welling in her eyes. "Protect us? By asking me to prove my loyalty? By asking me to prove that Zayn is yours? Do you hear yourself, Jonathan?" "I'm not asking you," he said quickly. The advisors don't live in this house," she interrupted, her voice rising. "They don't wake up every morning and look into the eyes of a child who is the perfect blend of both of us. They don't know what it's like to be me, to constantly have to defend my place in your life, in this country. And now you're letting them dictate how we handle this?" Jonathan fell silent, his arguments crumbling under the weight of her words. Alia took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but no less resolute. "I'll take your test, Jonathan," she said, her tone icy. "Not because I owe anyone proof, not because I need to clear my name, but because you're forgetting who we are." He flinched at her words, the disappointment in her voice cutting deeper than he thought possible. "We promised each other," she continued, her voice trembling. "We promised that no matter how hard it got, we would stand together. But right now, it feels like I'm standing alone." Jonathan reached for her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "I'll take the test," she repeated. "But don't think for a second that it won't change things between us. Because, Jonathan, this isn't about them anymore. It's about you. And whether you truly see me as your equal, your partner, your wife." With that, she turned and walked inside, leaving Jonathan alone in the fading light. He sank back onto the bench, his head in his hands. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly lost. He had fought so many battles against his political rivals, against injustice, against systemic inequality. But the battle he now faced, the battle to regain Alia's trust, felt like the hardest one of all. The next day, arrangements were made for the test. Alia went through the motions with quiet dignity, her face an unreadable mask. Jonathan tried to comfort her, but she kept her distance, her words clipped and formal. Zayn, too young to understand the gravity of what was happening, played happily in the corner, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. As the samples were taken and the process began, Jonathan felt a profound sense of shame. He had allowed the pressures of his role to drive a wedge between him and the woman he loved more than anything. And now, all he could do was wait. Wait for the results, wait for the storm to pass, and pray that when it was over, he would still have Alia by his side. The days following the paternity test demand were some of the hardest Alia had ever faced, but she refused to let the world see her break. She had learned long ago that strength wasn't about the absence of pain. It was about standing tall in the face of it, and that was exactly what she intended to do. Every morning she rose early, made breakfast for Zayn, and walked him to his small private preschool. The other parents, once warm and welcoming, now whispered behind her back, their pitying glances like daggers. Yet Alia met their eyes with quiet dignity, her chin held high. Zayn, oblivious to the murmurs, tugged at her hand, his little voice filling the air with stories about his classmates. She smiled down at him, her love for him an anchor in the storm. He was too young to understand the rumors, too innocent to grasp why reporters lingered outside their home, snapping pictures and shouting questions as they walked to the car. "Why do they always take pictures of us, Mama?" Zayn asked one morning, his dark, curious eyes gazing up at her. Alia knelt to his level, smoothing a hand over his unruly curls. "Because "They know how special you are, my love," she said, her voice steady even as her heart ached. "They just don't understand us yet. But one day they will." Satisfied with her answer, Zayn grinned and skipped ahead, his laughter echoing down the sidewalk. Aaliyah watched him, her resolve hardening. No matter how much the world tried to tear her down, she would not let it touch her son. At work, Aaliyah threw herself into her role as a lawyer and advocate for racial equality. Her days were filled with meetings, court appearances, and public speaking engagements, where she championed policies to dismantle systemic racism. The irony was not lost on her. Here she was, fighting for justice and equality, while her own family was being torn apart by prejudice and lies. Reporters hounded her at every turn, their questions invasive and cruel. "Mrs. Carter, how do you respond to the rumors about your infidelity? Is it true the president is questioning Zayn's paternity? Do you think your marriage can survive this scandal?" She ignored them all, her practiced smile never wavering. But behind closed doors, the weight of their words pressed heavily on her. She leaned on her closest friends, a tight-knit group of women who had been her support system long before she became the First Lady. "You don't have to stay, Aaliyah," her best friend Mira said one evening as they sat in Aaliyah's living room. Mira's tone was gentle but firm, her concern evident. "You deserve better than this. Jonathan is supposed to protect you, not make you prove yourself." Aaliyah sighed, staring into her cup of tea. "It's not that simple, Mira," she said quietly. "I love him, and I know he loves me. This isn't just about us, it's about the world we're trying to change together. If I walk away now, I'm letting them win." "But at what cost?" Mira pressed. "You're carrying all of this on your shoulders, and he's the one who put it there. Love shouldn't feel like this." Aaliyah looked away, her throat tightening. She knew her friends meant well, but they couldn't understand the depth of her bond with Jonathan. They hadn't seen the man who'd stayed up all night to comfort her after her father's funeral, or the man who had written her love letters during their long-distance courtship. They hadn't seen the way he looked at her when she walked into a room, as if she were the only person who mattered. "I'm not giving up on him," she said finally, her voice firm. "He's lost right now, but I believe in us. I believe in the man I married, and I'm going to fight for him, even if it feels like he's not fighting for me." Her friends exchanged worried glances, but didn't push further. They knew Aaliyah well enough to recognize her determination. At home, the distance between her and Jonathan remained, an unspoken tension that neither of them seemed able to bridge. He spent long hours at the office, avoiding the difficult conversations they both knew they needed to have. When he was home, he was distracted, his mind consumed by the paternity test and the political fallout. One night as she tucked Zayn into bed, he clung to her tightly. "Mama, why are you sad?" he asked, his small voice breaking her heart. "I'm not sad, sweetheart," she said, forcing a smile. "Yes, you are," he said, with the stubborn certainty only a 4-year-old could muster. "But it's okay. I'll make you happy." Aaliyah kissed his forehead, tears pricking her eyes. "You already do, my love," she whispered. After Zayn fell asleep, she sat by his bedside, watching his peaceful face. He was her light, her reason for enduring the storm. She couldn't let him see her crumble. In the days that followed, Aaliyah's quiet strength became a beacon for others. Her refusal to bow to the scrutiny inspired women across the country, particularly women of color who saw themselves in her. Letters poured into the White House, many of them addressed to her. "You are a role model," one woman wrote. "Watching you handle this with such grace gives me hope." Another letter read, "Thank you for showing the world that strength comes in many forms. You've reminded me to hold my head high, no matter what life throws my way. Aliyah kept the letters in a drawer in her office, reading them whenever the weight of the situation threatened to overwhelm her. They reminded her that she wasn't just fighting for herself or her family, she was fighting for every woman who had ever been judged for the color of her skin, every mother who had been questioned, and every wife who had been doubted. Through it all, Zayn remained her anchor. His laughter, his hugs, and his endless questions about the world reminded her of what truly mattered. He was her heart, her hope, and the reason she refused to give up. As the day of the paternity test results approached, Aliyah prepared herself for whatever lay ahead. She knew the truth, and she knew that no test could define her worth or her son's place in the world. But she also knew that this battle wasn't just about proving the truth. It was about reminding Jonathan and the world of who she truly was. The days after the paternity test demand were a blur for Jonathan. His every waking moment was consumed by an unrelenting gnawing feeling in his gut. The once clear path ahead of him seemed clouded, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed the one person who had stood beside him through it all. Aliyah. At night, when the weight of the presidency felt too heavy to bear, he found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling of their shared bedroom. He couldn't remember the last time they had shared an intimate moment, a quiet conversation, or even a simple touch. The connection they once had seemed like a distant memory, slipping further away with each passing day. Jonathan's mind often wandered back to the first time he had seen Aliyah. It had been at a university debate, years before he had even thought of running for office. She was fierce, her arguments sharp and precise, her passion for justice undeniable. Jonathan had been captivated not just by her intelligence, but by her poise. She had spoken with such conviction, her voice unwavering, and it was then that he had known. This was the woman who could stand beside him in the fight for change. Their first conversation had been a collision of words, a playful exchange of opinions that quickly turned into something more. Jonathan remembered how she had laughed, a sound so pure, so genuine, that it had made his heart skip a beat. She had smiled, that quiet, knowing smile that always made him feel like they shared some private joke that no one else would understand. But it wasn't just the laughter that had drawn him to her. It was the way she challenged him. Aliyah had never let him settle into complacency. She had always pushed him to be better, to see beyond the surface, to question everything, even in the early days of their relationship, when they had been nothing more than two young idealists dreaming about a better world. Aliyah had already been teaching him the true meaning of love, not the romantic, idealized version of it, but the kind that was rooted in honesty, trust, and a fierce commitment to standing by each other no matter what. Their wedding day had been a blur of joy and promises. As Jonathan stood at the altar looking into Aliyah's eyes, he had promised her the world. He had sworn to always honor her, to always protect her, to stand by her through every storm that came their way. The vows they had exchanged were more than just words. They were a declaration that they were a team, united in their pursuit of justice and equality. Now, as Jonathan lay awake in their bed, he couldn't help but feel that he had betrayed those promises. The woman he had once promised to protect, the woman who had believed in him even when the world was against them, was now standing at a crossroads, unsure of where to go next. And he had put her in that position. The sound of Aliyah's voice echoed in his mind, the way she had asked him, "Do you trust me?" Her words had been a quiet, painful plea, but it was her silence that had cut him the most. He had wanted to respond, to reassure her, but he had been too afraid to admit how much he was hurting. He had been too afraid to confront the truth of what he had done, to her, to their son, to their love. Jonathan's thoughts turned to the night they had spent in the Oval Office, working late together. She had stayed up with him long after midnight, helping him draft speeches that spoke of equality, inclusion, and hope. She had always been his sounding board, the one who helped him refine his ideas, the one who reminded him of what truly mattered. But now, all he had was a growing distance between them, a gap that seemed impossible to bridge. He had let the pressures of the presidency cloud his judgment, and now he was left to pick up the pieces. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a ton of bricks. How had it come to this? How had he allowed the opinions of his advisers, the scrutiny of the media, and the constant pressure to define his every decision? In that moment, Jonathan realized something he had been refusing to acknowledge for too long. He had lost sight of what really mattered. It wasn't his presidency, it wasn't his image, and it wasn't even the political battle he was fighting. It was Aliyah. It was their love, their family. That was what mattered. Jonathan closed his eyes and tried to remember the last time they had laughed together, the last time they had shared a quiet moment without the weight of the world pressing down on them. The memory felt distant, like something out of reach. He had been so consumed with the role of president, so focused on the external battles, that he had forgotten to fight for the woman who had stood by him every step of the way. He'd let her down, and now it seemed like she was slipping through his fingers. The guilt of it all began to seep into his bones, a cold ache that settled in his chest. How could he have doubted her? How could he have asked her to prove something that didn't need proving? Aliyah was the most loyal, loving, and strong woman he had ever known. And yet, in the face of these rumors and doubts, he had questioned her. Jonathan got out of bed and walked over to the window, looking out at the city that had once felt full of promise. He had always believed that he was working toward something greater, that he was fighting for a better future for everyone, especially his family. But in doing so, he had neglected the very thing that made him want to be a better person in the first place, Aliyah. He had allowed the world's expectations of him to shape his decisions, and now he was paying the price. He had always prided himself on his ability to make tough decisions, to take control of situations and steer them in the direction he believed was right. But now he was faced with a decision that terrified him more than anything else. Could he fix this? Could he earn back Aliyah's trust? And more importantly, did he even deserve to? As the days passed and the paternity test results loomed, Jonathan couldn't help but feel the weight of his own internal conflict. He had failed her, but he was determined to make things right. He had to find a way to bridge the gap between them, to rebuild the trust that had been broken. The journey ahead was uncertain, and the road to redemption seemed impossibly long. But for the first time in days, Jonathan found himself willing to try, to fight for Aliyah the way she had always fought for him. In the quiet hours of the night, Jonathan made a promise to himself. He would do whatever it took to win back her trust, to remind her that no matter what the world thought, he saw her, he valued her, and he loved her more than anything else in the world. The next morning, he reached for his phone and began typing. It wasn't a speech or a political statement this time. It was a letter to Aliyah, a letter from his heart, a letter that would tell her the truth, all the things he had been too afraid to say. It was the first step, and as he clicked send, Jonathan knew that the hardest part of the journey was still ahead. But at least now, he had finally found the courage to begin. The morning the paternity test results arrived, Jonathan found himself standing in the middle of his office, staring at the envelope with a mix of dread and relief. The sealed packet felt like a physical manifestation of the tension he had been carrying for weeks. The clock on the wall ticked louder than ever as he reached for the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. He had spent sleepless nights imagining all the possible outcomes, wondering whether the test would bring some semblance of peace, or if it would be another devastating blow to the fragile bond between him and Aliyah. But this, he thought, was different. This was about Zayn, their son, their family, the child he had vowed to protect above all else. With shaking hands, Jonathan opened the envelope and pulled out the letter. His eyes skimmed over the words, his heart pounding in his chest. He read it again to make sure he wasn't mistaken. Zayn Carter is confirmed to be the biological son of Jonathan Carter. The words were simple, but the weight of them hit him like a tidal wave. There it was, proof. The child he had loved as his own, the child who had brought them both so much joy, was his. There had never been a doubt in Aliyah's heart. But for Jonathan, this was the moment of clarity that he had longed for. The truth had been laid bare in front of him. But just as the relief started to settle in, another revelation began to unravel, one that would change everything. The letter wasn't the only thing Jonathan had been waiting for. There was more, a report from the investigative team he had hired, one he hadn't anticipated receiving so soon. The first part was expected, the results of the paternity test, but the second part was not, because it wasn't just about Zayn. As Jonathan read the report, his stomach churned. Investigators had uncovered something far worse than he could have imagined. The rumors of Aliyah's infidelity, the whispers that had tortured her for weeks, had been fabricated, constructed with the sole purpose of tearing their family apart. And worse yet, the mastermind behind it all was someone Jonathan had trusted deeply. The name at the top of the report made his blood run cold. David Mitchell. David had been Jonathan's closest advisor for years, a friend, a confidant, someone he had relied on to help him navigate the political minefields of his career. David had been by his side when Jonathan first ran for office, offering advice, strategy, and an unwavering support. But now, as Jonathan's eyes scanned the details, he saw the dark truth that had been hidden beneath David's friendly facade. David had orchestrated the entire scheme. He had planted false stories, leaked doctored photos, and manipulated the press, all in an effort to destroy Jonathan's marriage to Aliyah. The report detailed how David had become resentful of Jonathan's rising popularity, feeling that his influence and position in the administration was slipping away as Jonathan's power grew. In his jealousy, he had devised a plan to break Jonathan's family apart, starting with Aliyah. Jonathan's hands tightened around the report, his fingers crumpling the paper in his grip. He couldn't breathe. He felt as though the world was crashing down around him. His mind raced. How could David, someone who had known him so well, someone he had trusted, have done this? How could he have allowed such a betrayal to unfold? Jonathan had been so blind, so focused on the pressures of his presidency, that he had failed to see the truth. And now the consequences were devastating. The next few minutes passed in a blur as Jonathan tried to process everything. He could feel his anger rising, a fury like no other. David's treachery wasn't just about politics, it was about his family. It was about Aliyah, the woman he loved, who had been dragged through a nightmare of doubt and shame, all for the selfish whims of a man he had once called a friend. Jonathan's guilt, however, was far greater than his anger. It crashed over him like a tidal wave, pulling him under. The realization that he had doubted Aliyah, the woman who had stood by him in every moment, who had never wavered in her loyalty, was a crushing blow. He had been too quick to listen to rumors, to follow the advice of people who didn't care about the truth. But Aliyah had always known the truth. She had never wavered in her belief in him, in their love, and he had allowed his own insecurities to drive a wedge between them. The guilt gnawed at him. It was his fault that she had been hurt. He had failed her, and now, as the truth finally emerged, he realized just how deeply his actions had scarred their bond. His thoughts turned to Alia. She didn't deserve this. She deserved love, respect, and unwavering trust. Instead, she had been thrust into a storm that had nearly torn them apart. But more than anything, Jonathan realized, she deserved an apology, a deep, sincere apology. He had to fix this. He couldn't undo the damage, but he could do whatever it took to make it right. Jonathan knew the path to redemption wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be instantaneous, but he was willing to face the consequences of his actions, to confront the pain he had caused, and to rebuild their marriage on a foundation of truth and trust. With a shaking hand, Jonathan picked up his phone and dialed Alia's number. His heart raced as it rang, each second feeling like an eternity. When the voicemail picked up, Jonathan took a deep breath. "Alia, it's me. I don't know where to begin, but I need you to know the truth. Zayn is mine, and everything you've been accused of, it's all a lie. I was blind, and I let my fear and the pressure get the best of me. I doubted you when I should have been standing by you. I can't undo the pain I've caused, but I need you to hear me. Please, give me a chance to make this right. I love you. I love you more than I ever realized. And I'm so sorry. Please, come home." He hung up the phone, the weight of the words heavy in the silence that followed. But in his heart, he knew it was the first step toward healing. And this time, he wouldn't back down. The night before the televised address, Jonathan lay awake in bed, tossing and turning as the weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him. The decision had been agonizing, but deep down, he knew there was no other choice. He had hurt Alia, he had doubted her, and now the entire world had seen it. He could not undo the pain, but he could stand up and take responsibility, not just for his actions, but for the damage they had caused to the love he and Alia had worked so hard to build. Tomorrow was the day that everything would change, or fall apart. Jonathan had no idea how Alia would react to the public apology he was preparing, nor did he know how the world would view him afterward. The media would either crucify him for showing vulnerability, or they might just applaud him for his courage. Either way, he knew he had to do this for Alia and for their son. The evening was heavy with anticipation as Jonathan's team finalized the details of the broadcast. The set was carefully arranged in front of the White House, with cameras ready to capture every angle of his speech. The speechwriters had worked tirelessly to draft the perfect message, but Jonathan knew that no words could truly capture the depth of his regret. He had to speak from the heart. As the broadcast time drew near, Jonathan stood in front of the mirror, his suit perfectly pressed, but his face pale with the strain of the past few weeks. He adjusted his tie, his reflection staring back at him with a mixture of resolve and uncertainty. This wasn't a political speech. This wasn't about winning votes or swaying public opinion. This was about truth. This was about love. In the background, his staff moved around him in a flurry of activity. Cameras were being tested, microphones adjusted, and the control room buzzed with last-minute preparations. Yet Jonathan stood still, frozen in the moment, his mind replaying the words he had crafted for the world to hear. He thought about Alia, her strength, her grace, her unwavering loyalty through it all. How had he allowed the rumors, the whispers, the pressures of the world to make him question her? How had he forgotten the woman he had married, the one who had been his equal partner in everything they had achieved? And then there was Zayn, the precious child they had created together, a living testament to their love. How could Jonathan have let a moment of doubt come between them? How could he have doubted that Zayn was his son? The thought brought tears to his eyes. The show began. The cameras rolled. Jonathan walked toward the podium with a quiet determination. His hands were steady, but his heart raced in his chest. The lights were bright, the room silent except for the hum of the microphones. Jonathan stepped in front of the microphone, cleared his throat, and began. "My fellow citizens." His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it, a rawness that made the air feel heavy. "Tonight, I stand before you not as the president of this great nation, but as a man who has failed the person he loves most in this world, my wife, Aaliyah." The words hung in the air, and Jonathan paused, allowing them to sink in. The audience, millions of people across the country and around the world, was listening intently. Jonathan's eyes burned with the sting of the apology he was about to make. "I've spent my entire life serving this country," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "fighting for equality, justice, and progress. But none of that matters if I can't first be the man that Aaliyah deserves. My greatest failure has not been as president. It has not been in the Oval Office or on the world stage. My greatest failure has been as a husband. Aaliyah has been the epitome of loyalty, strength, and grace. She has stood by me through thick and thin, even when the world was questioning us, even when the rumors about our marriage were being twisted into lies. To doubt her was to doubt the very foundation of our love, and for that I am deeply, deeply sorry." A brief silence followed, and Jonathan could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. His emotions, once held in check, were threatening to spill over. He fought to keep himself composed, but the tears that welled up in his eyes betrayed him. He blinked rapidly, but they fell anyway, slow and steady. "To Aaliyah, I want to say this. You are the love of my life. You are everything I ever wanted and needed, and I have failed you. I have failed to stand by you when it mattered most. I've let the pressure of this office, the lies that were spread, and my own insecurities come between us. You never deserved that, and I will spend the rest of my life making it right." Jonathan took a deep breath, his chest tightening as he tried to steady his voice. The sincerity in his words was undeniable, but the guilt was still overwhelming. "I want to be the man you believed I could be. I want to fight for you the way you have always fought for me. I want to prove to you that I am worthy of your trust once more." He paused, the weight of the apology sinking in. "But it doesn't stop there. I won't just stand here and apologize to you. I will fight to ensure that anyone who perpetuated these lies, who sought to tear us apart, will be held accountable. I will take down anyone who tried to destroy our family, and I will never stop protecting you. You are my heart, and no one, not a single person, will ever come between us again." Jonathan's words were filled with a fierce resolve. He knew this was just the beginning of a long road to redemption, but the foundation had been laid. Aaliyah would see his sincerity. The world would see his vulnerability. And in time, they would rebuild. "I know that actions speak louder than words, and I will show you, Aaliyah, that my love for you is more than just a promise. It's the very thing that drives me every day." As Jonathan finished speaking, he gave a final look into the camera, his heart open, raw, and vulnerable. "Thank you, and Aaliyah, I love you." The broadcast ended, and the room fell into silence. The world was watching, but all Jonathan could think about was Aaliyah. Would she hear him? Would she see the sincerity in his apology? Would she find it in her heart to trust him again? As the cameras turned off and the lights dimmed, Jonathan was left standing in front of the podium, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way he had never known. His political career, his legacy, all of that seemed distant now. The only thing that mattered was Aaliyah. and he would do whatever it took to win her back. The moment the broadcast ended, Jonathan felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The studio lights dimmed, and he was left in the solitude of the moment, surrounded by a team of aides and advisors, all offering their congratulations or nods of approval. But none of it mattered. None of it could ease the ache in his chest, the emptiness that lingered in the pit of his stomach. He hadn't done this for the praise. He hadn't made that speech for the public. He had done it for her, Aaliyah. As the hours passed after the televised address, Jonathan's mind was consumed with the image of her. He needed to see her, to speak to her in person, to make sure that she knew how deeply sorry he was for every moment of doubt he had allowed to poison their love. He didn't want to waste another second. His heart was pounding in his chest as he rushed through the halls of the White House, out the door, and into his waiting car. The car sped through the quiet streets, his mind racing with the million things he wanted to say but wasn't sure how. The events of the past few weeks had shaken him to his core. He was used to being in control of his destiny, to directing his life with purpose. But this was different. This was about love, trust, and redemption. The car finally came to a stop outside their home. The house, which had once been filled with laughter and the promise of a bright future, now felt heavy with the weight of the pain that had clouded their lives in recent days. Jonathan stepped out of the car, his heart beating erratically in his chest. He walked toward the garden, a familiar place where he and Aaliyah had spent countless hours together, talking about their dreams, their hopes, and their future. The soft glow of the moon bathed the garden in an ethereal light, casting shadows on the grass and trees. And there she was, Aaliyah, sitting by the fountain, her face illuminated by the moon, her eyes distant, lost in thought. Jonathan's heart clenched at the sight of her. She looked so beautiful, so calm, yet there was an air of sadness around her. The woman who had always been his pillar of strength now seemed fragile, vulnerable. He could see the weight of the past weeks in the way her shoulders were slightly slumped, in the way her eyes avoided his as she looked up at the sky. He took a few hesitant steps forward, the distance between them feeling like an eternity. He wanted to say something, anything to break the silence, but words seemed inadequate. How could he possibly express the depths of his regret, his sorrow for what he had put her through? Before he could speak, Aaliyah turned her gaze toward him. Her face was unreadable, her eyes holding a mixture of emotions: pain, love, disbelief. She didn't say anything, but her expression said it all. She was waiting for him to prove that his words had been real, waiting for him to show her that he was truly remorseful for doubting her. Jonathan's throat tightened as he stood in front of her. The moment he had dreaded, the moment he had feared, was finally here. He knew he couldn't hide behind any more speeches, any more public apologies. This was the moment he had to face her, to face his mistakes, and to hope with all his heart that she could find it within her to forgive him. Without a word, Jonathan dropped to his knees before her. He felt the weight of his body press into the earth, the cool grass against his skin, and in that moment he realized just how far he was willing to go to make things right. Tears welled up in his eyes, unbidden but undeniable. The dam he had built up in his heart broke open as he looked at the woman who had stood by him through it all. "I failed you, Aaliyah." His voice trembled as he spoke, the rawness of his regret spilling out. "I failed you in the worst way possible, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it right. I love you. I never should have doubted you. You've always been the truth I've been searching for. Please, please forgive me." His heart was laid bare before her, the vulnerability of the moment overwhelming him. Every part of him ached for her to understand how deeply he regretted his actions. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, as Alia sat there, unmoving, her eyes locked on him. For a moment, it felt like an eternity. Jonathan's heart hammered in his chest, each beat a prayer that she would find it in herself to forgive him. Alia's eyes softened, the sharp edge of her hurt still visible, but now mingled with something else, something warm, something she had kept hidden deep within. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Jonathan's cheek, and he closed his eyes at the touch. She spoke then, her voice quiet but firm. "Jonathan, you hurt me. You hurt me in ways I can't even explain, but I never stopped loving you. I never stopped believing in us. And I think that's why it hurts so much, because I knew the truth. And yet you let the world's lies drive us apart." Her words were honest, raw, and filled with the pain she had carried for so long. But even through her hurt, Jonathan could hear the love in her voice, the same love that had always been there, even when they were on the brink of losing everything. She paused, and for a moment, Jonathan feared she might pull away. But instead, she leaned forward, her lips trembling as she pressed them gently against his. It was a soft, tentative kiss, a kiss that spoke of pain, of healing, of second chances, a kiss that whispered the promise of hope, of a future built not on perfection, but on redemption and love. Jonathan's arms immediately wrapped around her, pulling her closer, never wanting to let go. The kiss deepened, a silent promise passing between them, a promise that their love, though tested, was still very much alive. And in that moment, as they kissed beneath the moonlight, everything else faded away. Their son, Zayn, appeared at the edge of the garden, his small figure running toward them with his arms wide open. Jonathan and Alia broke the kiss and turned to see Zayn, his face bright with joy, his laughter ringing through the night air. Without a word, Zayn ran into their arms, and they enveloped him in a warm embrace, their family whole again. The world around them had been filled with chaos, rumors, and doubt, but in this quiet moment, in the peaceful embrace of their son, Jonathan and Alia found the peace they had both been searching for. They had survived the storm, and now their love was stronger than ever. As the three of them stood there together under the stars, Jonathan knew that the road ahead would not be easy. But he was willing to walk it, one step at a time, with Alia by his side and Zayn in his arms, because love, true love, was worth fighting for, and they were no longer afraid to fight for each other. The day of their public appearance dawned, and Jonathan stood before the mirror, the weight of the nation's gaze upon him. Today wasn't just another press conference or political speech. Today was different. This was about more than policy or approval ratings. It was about a message that would reverberate far beyond the confines of politics. It was about love, truth, and the power of standing together in the face of a world that often sought to tear people apart. Alia stood beside him, her presence a quiet strength. Her confidence had returned, but so had the tenderness in her eyes. The storm had passed, and while there would still be challenges ahead, she felt a peace she hadn't known in weeks. She knew this moment was bigger than them. It was bigger than their love story. It was about setting an example for a world desperately in need of healing. Together, they made their way to the podium. The cameras flashed as they walked hand in hand, their fingers interlaced, a simple gesture that held so much weight. This was the first time they were appearing publicly together since the whirlwind of rumors had torn through their lives. This was the moment when they would show the world that love, real love, could not be torn apart by hate or lies. The room was filled with journalists, politicians, and citizens, all waiting for them to speak. Jonathan stood tall, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before he turned to Alia. There was a silent understanding between them. This wasn't just about making things right for themselves, but about sending a message to the world that went beyond their personal story. Jonathan began. "Good evening, everyone," he said, his voice steady, but his heart raced. "I stand before you today not just as the president of this nation, but as a man who has learned the hardest lesson of his life. The lesson that love is not something that can be measured or manipulated. It is not defined by race, by culture, or by society's standards. It is defined by trust, respect, and the willingness to fight for what is real." He paused, taking a breath, before turning slightly toward Alia, his hand gently squeezing hers. "Alia and I have been through a great deal in the past few weeks. The lies, the rumors, the doubts, they tried to break us. But we've learned that no amount of hate or deception can destroy what is true. Our love is the truth, and that truth is stronger than anything the world can throw at us." Alia, who had remained quiet up until this point, stepped forward. Her presence was commanding, her voice calm but powerful. There was a quiet strength in the way she spoke, a wisdom that transcended her years. "The world is often quick to judge," Alia began, her voice carrying across the room, "to categorize, to label, to define what is acceptable and what is not. But love, true love, does not fit into any box. It is not limited by the color of our skin, the country we come from, or the history we carry. Love is not about where we come from. It's about where we are going. It's about trust, respect, and the courage to stand against prejudice." She let those words sink in, her gaze steady as she looked at the camera, at the people who were watching them. The weight of her message was not lost on anyone. "We are proof," she continued, her voice unwavering, "that no lie, no hate can destroy what is real. No matter how hard they try, love cannot be undone by the world's cruelty. We are proof that in the end, love will always prevail. And we, as a society, need to remember this. The future belongs to those who choose love over hate, who choose understanding over fear, who choose unity over division." Alia's words resonated in the silence that followed. Jonathan stood beside her, his hand still holding hers, as if to say, "I am here with you. I stand with you. We are one." His heart swelled with pride as he listened to her, knowing that the woman standing beside him was not just the love of his life, but also a voice of reason, compassion, and strength for a world in desperate need of healing. "Love is the ultimate act of resistance," Alia concluded, her voice filled with emotion. "When we choose to love, we reject the lies that society tells us about who we should be and who we should love. We stand up to the hatred that tries to divide us. And we choose the courage to create a future where love is the greatest force that binds us all together." The room was quiet, the weight of Alia's words settling into the hearts of everyone present. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere, an unspoken understanding that they were witnessing something important, something revolutionary. The audience was moved, and for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of unity in the air. The hatred, the division, the walls that had been built around society's expectations, they were beginning to crumble. As they finished speaking, the applause that followed was not just for Jonathan and Alia, but for the message they carried, for the change they were inspiring, for the love that had overcome so much. It was a standing ovation that transcended politics, race, and culture. It was a standing ovation for humanity. The cameras captured the moment, a picture-perfect snapshot of a couple who had faced the darkest of times and emerged stronger. The world was watching, but in this moment it wasn't just about them. It was about the hope they had ignited in others. As they walked off the stage hand in hand, Jonathan and Alia shared a look, one of understanding, of mutual respect, and of deep, abiding love. They had done it. They had fought the battles, endured the heartbreak, and emerged victorious. Their love had withstood the storm, and now it would serve as a beacon of hope for others. In that moment, Jonathan realized that the real work had only just begun. But with Alia by his side, there was no challenge too great, no enemy too powerful. Together they would continue to fight for what was right, not just for their love, but for the world. For the message that love, in all its forms, was the ultimate act of resistance. The world had witnessed their journey, and now it was time to join in the fight for a future where love was the greatest force of all.